On Christmas Day, 1957, and on New Year's Day, 1958, 18-year-old Lee Oswald was on maneuvers with fellow Marines in the South China Sea. At the same time, Harvey Oswald was living at the Hotel Senator in New Orleans and had been working at the Pfisterer Dental Lab for the past 3 months. By early 1958, Palmer McBride had been attending bi-monthly meetings of the New Orleans Amateur Astronomy Association for 3 years, most recently at the home of Walter Gerke, who lived in nearby Metairie, Louisiana. McBride told the FBI, quote, "In early 1958, I took Harvey Oswald with me to a meeting of the New Orleans Amateur Astronomy Association at the home of Walter Gerke," end quote. When interviewed by the FBI, Walter Gerke confirmed McBride's memory of meeting Harvey Oswald at his home in 1958. Gerke told the FBI, quote, "None of the meetings of the Astronomy Association were held at my house until about 1958, end quote. Gerke's statement meant that McBride and Harvey Oswald could not have attended Astronomy Association meeting at his house any time prior to 1958. Ralph Hartwell, Palmer McBride, William Wulf, and Walter Gerke's statements leave no doubt that Harvey Oswald attended an Astronomy Association meeting at Gerke's home in early 1958. In January 1958, James Harrison Vance was Palmer McBride's best friend and a member of the Astronomy Association. On one occasion, McBride asked Vance if he would work in his place at the Pfisterer Dental Lab, which Vance agreed to do. When the two young men arrived at the lab, McBride introduced Vance to Harvey Oswald. A few days later, on January 31st, 1958, the Astronomy Association held a meeting at Vance's house when the first U.S. satellite was placed in orbit aboard Explorer 1, launched from Cape Canaveral, Florida, at 9:38 p.m. Ralph Hartwell was the vice president of the Astronomy Association in 1955 when meetings were held at the Cunningham Observatory. In 1956, meetings were held at De La Salle High School. On December 18, 1956, Hartwell joined the Air Force and left New Orleans, but corresponded with members of the Astronomy Association with voice tape recordings. Hartwell told the FBI that while he was in the Air Force, he heard that Harvey Oswald either became a member or had attended meetings of the Astronomy Association. Hartwell remembered that Palmer McBride and William Wulf knew and had dealings with Harvey Oswald. On January 22, 1958, with Harvey Oswald in New Orleans, Lee Oswald left Subic Bay in the Philippines en route to Corregidor, a distance of 40 miles. In Corregidor, Lee Oswald spent most of his time with Zach Stout, George Wilkins, and Bobby Warren. This group of young Marines spent countless off-duty hours exploring caves, tunnels, and old battle sites from World War II. Lee Oswald took numerous color photographs of Stout, Wilkins, Warren, fellow Marines that are now located in the National Archives. In the spring of 1958, Palmer McBride and Harvey Oswald continued to deliver the finished products of the Pfisterer Lab to local dentists and continued to discuss astronomy and argue about communism. McBride recalled that he and Harvey Oswald also spent a lot of time talking about Dr. Zhivago, a new novel by Boris Pasternak. This novel was first published in the United States in 1958 and earned Pasternak the Nobel Prize for Literature. It's important to remember that McBride and Harvey Oswald could not have discussed Dr. Zhivago before this book was first published in 1958. A few members of the Warren Commission realized from the FBI report of Palmer McBride there was a duplicate Lee Harvey Oswald working with McBride at Pfisterer in 1957 and 58, while at the same time, Lee Oswald was in Japan. This is why the Warren Commission never interviewed McBride, never interviewed any members of the Astronomy Association, and never interviewed the owners or employees of Pfisterer. All of the records were collected by the FBI from the Pfisterer Dental Lab relating to Harvey Oswald disappeared while in their custody. Throughout the spring of 1958, Palmer McBride and Harvey Oswald continued their friendship and occasionally double-dated. On one occasion, when McBride, Harvey Oswald, and their dates attended a movie, Harvey Oswald began to talk about communism. The young girl with Harvey became so annoyed that she ended the date early and left. After this incident, McBride and Harvey Oswald's friendship began to cool, and they saw less and less of each other each week. In June 1958, Harvey Oswald told McBride that he was moving to Fort Worth with his mother, where he had a job selling shoes. When I asked McBride to pinpoint the date of Oswald's departure from Pfisterer's, he said, quote, "I joined the Air Force Reserves on August 15, 1958, and Harvey Oswald quit approximately 2 months earlier," end quote. It appears that Harvey Oswald and his caretaker mother left New Orleans sometime in June 1958 and returned to Fort Worth, Texas. In July, Harvey Oswald and the short, heavy-set Marguerite Impostor were living in Fort Worth. On July 29, 1958, the Marguerite Oswald Impostor opened a bank account at the First National Bank of Fort Worth. 18-year-old Harvey Oswald, who was living with his caretaker mother, wrote a letter to the dental lab and said that he had a job in Fort Worth selling shoes. The letter was read aloud to McBride and to the delivery boys by office manager Earl Williamson. Now, on November 22, 1963, after the assassination of President Kennedy, Palmer McBride was in the Air Force and stationed at Patrick Air Force Base in Cape Canaveral, Florida. After learning that Lee Harvey Oswald had been arrested in Dallas and charged with murdering President Kennedy, McBride contacted the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. McBride told officers that he had worked with Harvey Oswald at the Pfisterer Dental Laboratory in New Orleans in 1957 and 58. The officer who interviewed McBride prepared a handwritten report of the interview. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations then contacted the FBI and sent the handwritten report to the FBI office in Dallas and the FBI office in New Orleans. The Air Force officer who interviewed McBride wrote, in his own handwriting, what McBride said about his knowledge and friendship with Oswald while working with Oswald at the Pfisterer Dental Laboratory in 1957 and 58. The FBI received the handwritten interview of McBride and then prepared a typewritten 4-page FBI report that was given to the Warren Commission, identified as Commission Exhibit 1386 and published in the 26 volumes. This 4-page document was well known to the FBI and to the Warren Commission. This document and testimony from Palmer McBride and other employees or owners of the dental lab would have proved that Harvey Oswald was working at the Pfisterer Dental Lab in New Orleans in 1957 and 58, while at the same time Lee Oswald was in Japan and on maneuvers in the Philippines and the South China Sea. In 1996, I traveled to California and I met Palmer at his home in Sun Valley. McBride had recently retired from a 30-year career working for NASA. It didn't take long to realize that McBride was very intelligent and possessed a superb memory. McBride remembered dates, times, and places from the 1950s and 1960s better than I could remember events from last year. McBride told officers from the Office of Special Investigations that he met Harvey Oswald while working at the dental lab in the fall of 1957 and worked with Oswald until June of 1958. When high-level FBI officials realized that Marine Corps records showed that Lee Oswald was stationed in Japan from September 1957 through November of 1958, they knew this was a serious problem that could expose two Oswalds. Quite simply, one Lee Harvey Oswald could not be working in New Orleans and in the Marine Corps in Japan at the same time for 8 months. Following the assassination, FBI agents were immediately sent to the Pfisterer Dental Laboratory and confiscated all employment records related to Harvey Oswald. They interviewed the company owners and interviewed 10 employees. Palmer McBride told me the FBI told each and every employee in the dental lab and the owners of the lab not to discuss the case among themselves or with anyone. James Vance, who knew Harvey Oswald from both the dental lab and the Astronomy Association, was interviewed at length by the FBI. Vance said, quote, "They really shook me up," end quote. Employees and owners of the dental lab and members of the New Orleans Amateur Astronomy Association who knew Harvey Oswald in the fall of 1957 and the winter-spring of 1958 were very important witnesses. But their statements and knowledge of Harvey Oswald in New Orleans could never be made public. This is why neither Palmer McBride nor any of the owners or employees of the dental lab testified before the Warren Commission. In 1997, I brought Palmer McBride to a JFK conference in Dallas. Palmer talked with many attendees and briefly addressed the audience. While in Dallas, Palmer telephoned his old friend, James Vance, who was then living in Mexico. They talked about their adventures in New Orleans and their memories of Harvey Oswald. Palmer also renewed his acquaintance with Walter Gerke, who was then living in Denver, Colorado. Palmer asked Gerke if he had any records from the Astronomy Association meetings in the 1950s. Gerke did not have any records, but still remembered the day when McBride brought Harvey Oswald to an association meeting at his home in early 1958. Presiding over that January 1958 meeting at Gerke's home was McBride's good friend, William Wulf, a student at Corregidor High School in the 11th grade. Gerke recalled that Harvey Oswald praised communism and recent Russian space successes, much to the dismay of association members. McBride said the members were so annoyed with Harvey Oswald's pro-communist talk that Wulf finally told Oswald, quote, "If you like Russia so damn much, why don't you just go over there," end quote. This was the first and only time that Harvey Oswald attended an Astronomy Association meeting, and it occurred at Walter Gerke's home in early 1958, while Lee Oswald was with fellow Marines on maneuvers in the South China Sea. I first spoke with William Wulf via telephone in November 1993. I asked Wulf the year that he met Harvey Oswald. Wulf thought for a minute and said, quote, "It was either late 1957 or early 1958, end quote. I then asked Wulf if he remembered the Warren Commission attorney asking him if he met Harvey Oswald in 1955. Wulf replied, quote, "I don't remember telling them that, but it's possible," end quote. Neither Wulf nor Palmer McBride ever understood why Wulf was called to testify before the Warren Commission instead of McBride. Wulf told me, quote, "McBride worked with Harvey Oswald every day for 8 months at the dental lab, but I barely knew Oswald. Why did the Warren Commission interview me instead of interviewing Palmer? Question mark." Wulf and McBride discussed this topic on several occasions, and they were never able to understand why the Warren Commission interviewed Wulf instead of McBride. The Warren Commission, and later the House Select Committee, and later the ARRB, never interviewed Palmer McBride, never interviewed William Wulf, never interviewed members of the Astronomy Association, and never interviewed any of the employees or owners of the Pfisterer Dental Lab. Today, we understand why. We now know that both the FBI and the Warren Commission did their best to cover up Harvey Oswald working in New Orleans in 1957 and 58, while Lee Oswald was in Japan. The House Select Committee and the ARRB simply ignored McBride. In 1996, I personally met with William Wulf for lunch in his hometown of Slidell, Louisiana. Wulf worked as a computer systems analyst. Wulf said, quote, "I was just a kid and was so overwhelmed by the events and testifying before those people that I didn't remember much. The one thing I do remember is that it seemed to me they were mostly interested in what Oswald had to say about communism and about my father kicking Oswald out of our house," end quote. Wulf and I talked about Harvey Oswald, McBride, the Dental Laboratory, and the Astronomy Association for hours. I again asked Mr. Wulf if he could pinpoint the date of his first meeting with Harvey Oswald by listing his years of attendance in junior high and high school, and then relating those years to his activities in the Astronomy Association. Wulf wrote on a napkin the years of his junior high school attendance and his sophomore year at De La Salle High School in 1955 to 1956. Wulf then recalled that he had missed the entire 1956-57 school year due to illness. Wulf said, quote, "When I returned to school, I began my junior year at Corregidor High School in the fall of 1957, and I again attended meetings of the Astronomy Club. I met Harvey Oswald sometime after Christmas 1957, probably in early 1958. I met him for the first time at Walter Gerke's house when he was with McBride," end quote. This meeting occurred in early January 1958 and was the only time that Harvey Oswald visited Gerke's house or attended an astronomy meeting. But it was not the last time that Harvey Oswald and William Wulf would meet. In the late winter of 1958, Palmer McBride took Harvey Oswald to William Wulf's house in New Orleans. Wulf told the Warren Commission, quote, "McBride brought Oswald over to my house one evening about 10:30 p.m. or so. We got into a very long conversation that lasted maybe until 3 a.m., about 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning," end quote. A couple of weeks later, McBride and Oswald returned to Wulf's house for a second visit. Wulf told the Warren Commission, quote, "The second time I met him was under the same circumstances. This boy, McBride, brought him, Oswald, over to my home. We had another long conversation, and this time I was interested in history, and he brought up, I don't know how we got around to it, communism. And he started bringing up his association. He believed in Marxism, Lenin, the Lenin theory, and that he advocated this concept of communism. He even mentioned that he had tried to join a cell of the Communist Party in New Orleans, but he couldn't find any, apparently. We got into a discussion on communism, and he was very vehement about it. And my father, this is about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and we ended up waking my father up, and he came back and heard the conversation. And my father had enough of communism when he was in World War II, World War I on the German side. And when he got out, the socialist communist revolt was going on in Germany. He was not the man to accept someone else's view, especially when this boy at his age was very antagonistic to anyone who didn't believe in his way. So my father literally threw him out, end quote. This was Harvey Oswald's second and last visit to William Wulf's house, and the second time that William Wulf's father saw Harvey Oswald. Now, in June 1960, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover wrote to the State Department about somebody using Oswald's birth certificate. Now, this is when Oswald was in Russia. Hoover wrote, quote, "Since there is a possibility that an impostor is using Oswald's birth certificate, any current information the Department of State may have concerning subject will be appreciated," end quote. Why would the director of the FBI be concerned about an impostor using someone else's birth certificate unless Hoover was already familiar with and had a file on Lee Harvey Oswald? In June 1960, Harvey Oswald was in Russia, and there's no indication that Hoover dispatched FBI agents to locate an Oswald impostor in the United States. We are therefore able to conclude with a reasonable amount of certainty that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover knew about Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald several years before November 22nd, 1963, and he became familiar with each of their backgrounds. From 1960 to November 1963, the FBI amassed a file of over 100 reports relating to Oswald, many of which indicated there was a second Oswald. On April 27, 1961, the special agent in charge of the New Orleans FBI office sent a memo to Hoover informing him that the FBI office in New Orleans had reviewed files of the Office of Naval Intelligence for Lee Harvey Oswald. The FBI is now reviewing files in the Office of Naval Intelligence for Lee Harvey Oswald in 1961. The Marines are with the Office of Naval Intelligence. In 1961, April, Oswald was still in Russia. A year later, in June 1962, Harvey Oswald returned with his Russian wife and child to the United States. 3 months later, on September 7, 1962, Hoover sent documents relating to Lee Harvey Oswald to CIA Deputy Director Richard Helms. Hoover wrote, quote, "For your information, I am enclosing communications which may be of interest to you," end quote. Now, the FBI was not the only government agency collecting information and reports about Oswald prior to the assassination. Richard Case Nagell was a highly decorated United States Army veteran, a counterintelligence officer, and a CIA double agent with ties to Russia. Nagell had observed and then penetrated a group that included Lee Harvey Oswald, and he learned they were planning the assassination of President Kennedy. Working as a double agent, Nagell refused to execute the orders given by his Russian handler, which was to foil the assassination plot by convincing Oswald that he was being set up as a patsy, or in the event he was not successful in doing that, to kill Oswald. In September 1963, Nagell sent a letter to J. Edgar Hoover advising him of an assassination plot against President Kennedy that involved Lee Harvey Oswald, 2 months before the assassination. Nagell's letter was never acknowledged by the FBI. On September 20th, 1963, Nagell entered the state bank in El Paso, Texas, and fired 2 shots into a wall at the bank. After firing the .45 caliber pistol, Nagell walked outside the bank and waited for police to arrive. Nagell was arrested, and while in custody, the police found a Department of Defense card on Nagell with the name Lee Oswald and Oswald's photograph. Now, Nagell managed to avoid any involvement with the assassination of President Kennedy, but he then spent years in prison. Following the assassination of President Kennedy, the Dallas police collected 225 items of Harvey Oswald's personal possessions from his room at 1026 North Beckley and from Ruth Payne's home in Irving, Texas. Each of these 225 items, each one, was dated, initialed, and inventoried twice by the Dallas police. The first one was a handwritten inventory. The second one was a typewritten inventory. The following day, these photographs were photographed while lying on the floor of Dallas Police Headquarters. The same day, these 225 items were quietly returned to FBI in Washington, D.C. Now, 3 days later, only 3 days later, on November 26, the FBI returned the original 225 items that were initialed and dated and inventoried by the Dallas police. But the FBI also sent the Dallas police an additional 230 items of so-called evidence. Among the additional 230 items of so-called evidence were several fabricated W2 forms for Dolly Shue, 2 Jacks, J.R. Michaels, and Pfisterers from 1955 through 1958. The FBI wants us and the public to believe that W2 forms for the years 1955 and 1956 were sent to 17-year-old Oswald and kept by him in pristine condition for the next 7 years, and were then found by the Dallas police among his meager possessions in his rooming house. In November 1963, we're supposed to believe that Oswald carried photographic copies of old W2 forms with him through the Marine Corps. I say photographic copies because the FBI did not send W2 forms to the Dallas Police Office. They sent photographic copies of the W2 forms. And we're supposed to believe that Oswald carried copies of old W2 forms with him through the Marine Corps, through Russia, moving to Fort Worth, moving to New Orleans, moving to Dallas. Maybe they would like us to believe that his mother held on to these photographs for him while she moved to dozens of different locations in New Orleans, Fort Worth, and Dallas. The FBI wants us to believe that Dallas police found 1955 and 1956 W2 forms for Oswald in the 1950s, but they didn't find Oswald's 1962 W2 forms from Leslie Welding or from Jagger's Charles Stovall. FBI. On November 22nd, 1963, when Director Hoover was told that Lee Harvey Oswald shot President Kennedy, Hoover was prepared. Hoover knew where to send his agents, and he knew which records and documents relating to Harvey Oswald needed to be seized. Hoover realized that many of Oswald's school records and employment records from 1952 through 1958 had to be changed or destroyed. Hoover also knew, or was told on November 22nd, that the American public could never be told about the two Oswalds or about the CIA's Oswald Project. The FBI's first priority was to locate and seize records that would show Lee Oswald and Harvey Oswald in different locations at the same time. This is why the FBI seized payroll records from two Jacks within hours of the assassination, ninth grade school records from Stripling Junior High in Fort Worth the next morning, payroll records from the Pfisterer Dental Laboratory, and all records related to Oswald from Pfisterer on Monday. They visited J.R. Michaels on Tuesday and were soon given Oswald's original New York City school records. Now, every one of the records that I just mentioned were destroyed. The only evidence, so-called evidence, that we have are black and white photographs in the National Archives. During the next 3 days, Harvey Oswald's Minox spy camera became a light meter. Lee Oswald's driver's license and driver's license file disappeared from the Texas Department of Public Safety. The FBI had collected dozens of items of evidence that needed to be fabricated, altered, or manipulated to cover the existence of two Oswalds. On Monday morning, 11/25/1963, FBI agents arrived at Pfister's. The agents took the owners and employees of the company one by one into a private room, told them they're not to discuss the Oswald matter among themselves or with anyone. And the agents then took all the records and all the files relating to Harvey Oswald's employment, and they left the building. Now, these records would prove that Harvey Oswald was working in New Orleans in 1957 and 58, while at the same time, Lee Oswald was in the Marine Corps. Now, the FBI needed to find a solution for this problem of Oswald in New Orleans in 1957 and 58, while at the same time, Lee Oswald was in the Marine Corps in Japan. The FBI's solution for Harvey Oswald, working in New Orleans in 1957 and 58, while Lee Oswald was in Japan, was simple. They chose to fabricate W2 form that would create the illusion that Harvey Oswald was working at Pfister's in 1956, not 1957 and 58, but in 1956 before he joined the Marines. Now, they chose the 1952 W form copy C, which was issued to Oswald in the year 1956. That's what they chose. Copy C of a W2 form was given to company employees at the end of the tax year for their personal records. Now, after fabricating this W2 form to show the year 1956 rather than 1957 and 58, this form needed to be placed among Oswald's personal possessions and returned to the Dallas police. So, Harvey Oswald's employment at Dolly Shoe, Two Jacks, J.R. Michaels, Pfister's, and the Marine Corps, Department of the Navy, required that payroll taxes be withheld from payroll checks and sent to both the Internal Revenue Service and to the Louisiana Department of Labor. Deductions were made by each of these companies from Harvey Oswald's payroll checks, and they were sent to the Social Security Administration, to the Internal Revenue Service, and to the Louisiana Department of Revenue. These government records would have confirmed the beginning and ending dates of 15-year-old Lee Oswald's employment at Two Jacks in 1955 and 56. and these records would have confirmed the beginning and ending dates of 17-year-old Harvey Oswald's employment at the Pfisterer Dental Lab in 1957 and 58. The FBI, Warren Commission, House Select Committee, ARRB, any one of them could have requested Harvey Oswald's and Lee Oswald's payroll records from federal, state governments, but they didn't. Why not? Obviously, these records would expose two Oswalds and two Marguerite Oswalds. For example, IRS and Louisiana tax records for the years 1957 and 58 would show that Harvey was working at Pfister's for 8 months. Lee Oswald was in the Marine Corps. Now, these government records could never be given to the Warren Commission, and these records could never be made public. So, within days of President Kennedy's assassination, all of Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald's original employment records as a teenager were confiscated by the FBI, and all of these records disappeared. Only black and white photographs of a few of these questionable documents remain at the National Archives. But what about income tax reports and records sent to the Internal Revenue Service and to the Louisiana Department of Revenue? What about payments to Social Security and their records? Surely some of these government records would remain intact. Now, the 225 items of evidence collected by the Dallas police were sent to the FBI in Washington, D.C. early morning hours of the 23rd of November. 3 days later, on November 26, the FBI returned the original 225 items of evidence to the Dallas police. But in addition, the FBI sent 235 items of evidence to the Dallas police. Among these additional 230 items of so-called evidence were these fabricated 1956 W2 forms. The FBI wants us and the public to believe that a fabricated W2 form for the year 1956 was given to 17-year-old Oswald. But yet, the W2 form returned to the Dallas police was a black and white photograph found by the Dallas police, apparently under Oswald's possessions. But we know the Dallas police did not find the W2 because the Dallas police did not initial it, did not date it, and it's not on their list of inventory. How do we know which of the 230 and the 225 items, that's a total of 455 items, how do we know which of these items were added by the FBI? Now that's real simple. It's very simple. The items found by the Dallas police were dated, initialed, and listed on a handwritten and on a typewritten inventory that's published in the Warren volumes. But the fabricated Pfisterer W2 form was not initialed, not dated, and not inventoried by Dallas police detectives. The only initials on this fabricated W2 form are RF, and those are the initials of FBI document examiner Robert Frazier. This W2 form was fabricated by the FBI in order to create the illusion that Oswald worked at Pfister in 1956, rather than in 1957-58, as reported by Palmer McBride. Now, the dollar amounts shown on this fabricated W2 form were never verified or matched with state tax records, federal tax records, or with Social Security. Now, this is very important. The FBI's fabricated W2 form, the one that was fabricated, disappeared, and only black and white photographs were given to the Warren Commission. At Dallas Police Headquarters, these 450 items of evidence that were returned by the FBI were identified and photographed jointly by the Dallas Police and the FBI. All of these 450 items were identified as, quote, Oswald's possessions, and they're all listed and printed in the Warren volumes. Once again, the 455 items that appear in the Warren volumes were the original 225 items found by the Dallas Police and the additional 230 items of so-called evidence that the FBI sent to the Dallas Police. Now, my friend and researcher Jim Hargrove sent copies of 5 FBI fabricated W2 forms to Don Stafford, an archivist at the IBM Corporation. After carefully reviewing these 1955 and 1956 W2 forms from 3 different companies and 2 different years, this IBM archivist, Don Stafford, said that all of these W2 forms from 3 different companies, 2 different years, were typed with the same typewriter. So W2 forms from 3 companies in 2 different years were all typed with the same typewriter. These W2 forms are obvious fabrications created by the FBI in an attempt to merge the teenage employment and school history of Harvey and Lee Oswald into one and only one Lee Harvey Oswald. The Air Force Office of Special Investigations sent Palmer McBride's statement to the FBI. McBride said that Harvey Oswald, while working at Pfister's, lived at the Hotel Senator in New Orleans in 1957 and 58. FBI agents were sent to the Hotel Senator to search hotel registration cards for Marguerite Oswald. But the agents did not request, I'm going to say it again, the agents did not request hotel records for the years 1957 and 58 as reported by Palmer McBride. The FBI agents specifically asked for records for Marguerite and Harvey Oswald at the hotel in 1955 and 1956. Well, no records were found for the years 1955 and 56. This is yet another example of how the FBI was able to avoid troublesome and conflicting evidence, but make it appear as though they had done their job. The FBI conducted an investigation and they wrote a report, but they intentionally reviewed hotel records for 1955 and 56 instead of the years 1957 and 1958. The FBI was then able to report that Oswald never lived at the Hotel Senator. More FBI cover-up. The FBI gave the Warren Commission a copy of Palmer McBride's interview with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, which the Warren Commission identified as Commission Exhibit 1386 and published in the 26 volumes. After reading the details in Palmer McBride's interview, the Warren Commission was not interested in determining the beginning and ending dates of Oswald's employment at Pfister's. The Warren Commission realized that Harvey Oswald, living in New Orleans in 1957 and 58 while working at Pfister, was a serious problem and it could not be ignored. The Warren Commission also knew they could never interview Palmer McBride or Pfister employees or owners of the company because these people knew, or they could quickly find out, the years when Oswald worked at the dental lab. And if Palmer McBride were interviewed by the Warren Commission, he would provide the names of Pfisterer Dental Lab owners and employees, members of the New Orleans Amateur Astronomy Association, who would all confirm Oswald was in New Orleans in 1957 and 58. So, for the Warren Commission, avoiding Palmer McBride was crucial. The Warren Commission needed to find a witness who would remember Harvey Oswald working at the dental lab. Now, they already had from the FBI a W2 form showing that Oswald worked there in 1956. So they needed a witness who could corroborate that year or a year close to it, but a witness who did not know Oswald closely, a witness who knew Oswald only casually. The Warren Commission began to focus their attention on McBride's friend, William Wulf, and William Wulf's father. It was Wulf's father who was irritated when Harvey Oswald came to his home praising the benefits of communism. On 2 separate occasions, William Wulf's father threw Harvey Oswald out of his home. The Warren Commission wrote about Harvey Oswald praising communism when he attended an astronomy association at Gerke's home, supporting Castro in Cuba in the Marines, and continuously discussing communism with McBride while working at Pfisterer. The Warren Commission was focusing their attention on Harvey Oswald and his interest in communism, while paying very little attention, if any, to the dates of Oswald's employment at Pfisterer's. From McBride's FBI interview, the Warren Commission learned that McBride's best friend, William Wulf, had met with Oswald on 3 separate occasions, but he knew little about Oswald working at the dental lab. So, the Warren Commission decided to interview William Wulf. The Commission's refusal to interview McBride demonstrates that one or more members of the Warren Commission knew that Oswald was working with McBride in 1957 and 1958 and knew it was a very serious problem. But when the FBI gave the Warren Commission the W2 form, the 1956 W2 form from Pfisterer's, everything changed. The Warren Commission now had a document that showed Oswald working at Pfister in 1956 before he joined the Marine Corps in October. The Warren Commission now relied on this 1956 W2 form to establish the year when Harvey Oswald worked at Pfister. When Wulf testified before the Warren Commission, he was questioned by attorney Wesley Liebler. In his opening statement to William Wulf, attorney Liebler said, and I quote, "We want to inquire of you concerning possible knowledge that you have of Lee Harvey Oswald during the time that he lived in New Orleans during the period 1954 and 1955. Before we get into the details of that, however, would you state your full name for the record?" End quote. Wulf replied, "William Eugene Wulf." Liebler's opening statement was an attempt to intentionally and dishonestly establish 1954 and 55 as the years when Wulf knew Harvey Oswald, instead of 1957 and 1958, as reported by Palmer McBride. When Liebler asked Wulf if he knew Oswald in 1955, Wulf replied, quote, "1955, yes, but it is sketchy. I really cannot say for sure. I could get it, the date, from the Astronomy Club's records," end quote. But no one in the Warren Commission asked for the Astronomy Association records. In fact, the Warren Commission never asked for any documents or records whatsoever that would have established the dates of Harvey Oswald's employment at Pfister. During most of the interview, Wesley Liebler focused attention on Harvey Oswald's interest in communism and Wulf's father kicking Oswald out of his home. Another clear and intentional cover-up by the FBI and the Warren Commission. Now, in the mid-1990s, I wrote to the Assassination Records Review Board and provided them with the names of Palmer McBride, William Wulf, Linda Faircloth, then the president of Pfisterer Dental Lab in New Orleans. I wrote a short synopsis of their statements and requested the ARRB interview these people for the historical record. McBride's name appears on internal ARRB memos, but neither he, Wulf, nor Faircloth were contacted. The ARRB's reluctance to contact these people followed the all-too-familiar program and pattern of the FBI Warren Commission and HSCA ignoring troublesome witnesses. More government cover-up. It is worth remembering that the FBI and/or the Warren Commission collected documentation, time cards, and interviewed the owners and accountant of Dolly Shoe, collected payroll records from Jared F. Tujak Company, J.R. Michaels, Jaggers Chow Stovall, and the Book Depository, and Oswald's employment checks. But there are no payroll records from Pfisterer, no FBI reports of interviews with the owners or employees, nor did the Warren Commission show any interest in interviewing the owners or employees of Pfisterer. Finally, the Warren Commission did not request or obtain a single document relating to the beginning or ending dates of Oswald's employment at Pfisterer's. Why not? Because, as we have seen, payroll records, federal and state tax reports, Social Security contributions, the owners, they could easily have confirmed Oswald's dates of employment as 1957 and 58, while at the same time, Lee Oswald was in Japan. We now understand why and how the dates of Oswald's employment at Tujak's and Harvey Oswald's employment at Pfisterer's had to be changed. We also understand the true meaning of the memo that Warren Commission Attorney Albert Jenner wrote to counsel J. Lee Rankin. Now, this is very important. On April 10, 1964, Mr. Jenner wrote, quote, "My purpose was to obtain a chronology of the life, school, places of residence, etc. of Mrs. Oswald, her several marriages, her husbands, and her 3 children, and in particular, Lee Harvey Oswald's. Our depositions and examination of records and other detail disclose that there are details in Mr. Eli's memoranda which will require material alteration and in some cases omission," end quote. Material alteration and omission. The instructions of Warren Commission General Counsel were clear. Certain background information on Oswald and his mother, uncovered by Warren Commission Attorney John Hart Eli, had to be altered, and in some cases omitted. We now realize that Mr. Jenner and lead counsel J. Lee Rankin likely knew about the 2 Oswalds. We now know that much of the background information collected by Warren Commission Attorney John Hart Eli on Lee Harvey Oswald was altered and omitted. I have all of Mr. Eli's typewritten notes, and these notes related to Oswald's whereabouts in the Marines, and in his notes there are dozens of underlinings, words circled, question marks, and phrases like, quote, "doesn't make sense." FBI again. But I think the most important was Mr. Eli wrote, his own handwriting, quote, "What's happening here? A switch would fit McBride," end quote. Now we know that Warren Commission Attorney John Hart Eli knew about Palmer McBride and a second Oswald. The FBI's fabrication of the 1956 W2 form was significant. The Warren Commission, with no documentation whatsoever and only a photograph of the FBI's fabricated W2 form, they wrote, quote, in January 1956. In January 1956, he, Oswald, worked briefly as an office boy for J.R. Michaels. For several months thereafter, he was a messenger for the Pfisterer Dental Laboratory, end quote. That's it. That's all they wrote. Nothing more. Not a single date of employment at Pfisterer. Not a single document from Pfisterer. Not a single witness from Pfisterer to show the dates of Harvey Oswald's employment at Pfisterer. No proof whatsoever. But what did they write? Several months thereafter, he was a messenger for the Pfisterer Dental Laboratory. That's it. Harvey Oswald's employment at Pfisterer in 1956 was an illusion created by the FBI and the Warren Commission, and it's a complete fabrication. The FBI and the Warren Commission had changed the dates of Oswald's employment from 1957 and 58 to 1956. Without the FBI and Warren Commission colluding to change Harvey Oswald's employment at Pfisterer's in 1957 and 58, there was no possible way to explain Lee Oswald in the Marines in Japan and the South China Sea, while at the same time Harvey Oswald was working at Pfisterer in New Orleans. It's now obvious that at least one or more members of the Warren Commission, and most certainly former CIA Director Allen Dulles, Attorney John Hart Ely, Wesley Liebler, and likely Albert Jenner and J. Lee Rankin, knew about Harvey Oswald's employment at the Pfisterer Dental Lab in 1957 and 58. It's now obvious that certain members of the FBI and certain members of the Warren Commission were co-conspirators in covering up the existence of Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald. In 1997, I contacted and interviewed Linda Faircloth, then the president of Pfisterer Dental Laboratory located in Metairie, Louisiana. Linda explained that Pfisterer was now a nationwide company and held annual meetings for company presidents. A few years earlier, Ms. Faircloth was chosen as speaker to prepare a talk and discussion at the annual meeting of her company. Her subject of choice was Lee Harvey Oswald, who she learned from the company's owners had worked for Pfisterer in New Orleans in 1957 and 58. It was at Pfisterer where Harvey Oswald met and became friends with Palmer McBride. Now, the covering up of Oswald's employment at Pfisterer's had other consequences as well. After Harvey Oswald's death on November 24, 1963, his widow, Marina, applied for survivor's benefits from Social Security. According to the Social Security Administration, Marina Oswald was entitled to benefits based upon her husband's lifetime earnings, calculated as though he had reached full retirement age. The Social Security's website quotes, I will quote, "How much your family could receive in benefits depends on your average lifetime earnings. The higher your earnings were, the higher the benefits would be. We calculate a basic amount as if you had reached full retirement age at the time you die." That's the end of that quote. Now, Marina Oswald was entitled to receive survivor's benefits based upon her husband's lifetime earnings. However, in 1964, unknown to Marina, her husband's records at the Social Security Administration had been altered. There were no records of Harvey Oswald's employment at all in the 1950s. No record of his employment or earnings or Social Security contributions at Dolly Shoe, Two Jacks, Pfisterers, J.R. Michaels, or 3 years in the Marine Corps. Why not? Why were there no records for Harvey Oswald's employment for over 5 years in the 1950s? Again, Social Security records would show that Lee Oswald's year-long employment at Two Jacks in 1955 and 56, instead of only working 2 months at Two Jacks as reported by the Warren Commission. Social Security records would show Lee Oswald's employment in Two Jacks in September 1956, while at the same time Harvey Oswald was attending Warren Easton High School. Social Security records would show Lee Oswald's employment in the Marine Corps in 1956, 1957, 1958, and 1959, while at the same time Harvey was employed for 8 months in 1957 and 58 at the Pfisterer Dental Laboratory in New Orleans. Social Security records for Harvey Oswald's employment and Lee Oswald's employment in the 1950s had to disappear, and those records did disappear. Oswald's first year of lifetime employment, according to Social Security records that they gave to Marina, was in 1962 after he returned from the Soviet Union. When Marina applied for Social Security benefits, the Social Security Administration gave her benefits based only on Harvey Oswald's earnings in 1962 and 1963. What we are seeing here is Social Security covering up government records for Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald from 1955 through 1958. During the winter-spring of 1958, Lee Oswald was on maneuvers in the Philippines. On the night of January 5th, 1958, Martin Shrand was guarding 2 rows of 80 trucks near the water's edge at Subic Bay. About 8 p.m., the shotgun issued to Shrand discharged into the left side of his ribcage underneath his armpit. A guard, patrolling in a boat near the water's edge, heard the blast, but saw no activity in the vicinity of the waterfront. Lieutenant Commander Clark Waldridge was a security officer on duty that night and arrived at the scene within minutes. A subsequent investigation revealed powder burns on the inside of Shrand's left arm and his left rib cage, which indicated the shotgun had discharged when aligned vertically with his body. Shrand's death was ruled accidental and thought to have been the result of his loading a live round into the chamber of the weapon and then impacting the butt of the gun on the ground, which caused the weapon to discharge into his left rib cage. Now, Zach Stout told me that he was due to relieve Shrand at midnight, but was called in early after the shooting accident occurred. Zach said that he remembered a piece of Christmas candy laying on the ground in the middle of Shrand's coagulated blood. And he never forgot his long night on guard duty. A Marine acquaintance of Oswald's, Donald Camerata, told the FBI that he heard rumors Oswald had in some way been involved or was responsible for Shrand's death. Zach Stout, who was with Oswald when Shrand was shot, told me anyone who claimed that Oswald was in some way responsible was crazy. I was with Oswald, and we were far away from Shrand when he was shot, end quote. On January 22nd, 1958, Lee Oswald boarded a landing ship tank en route to Corregidor, a distance of 40 miles. They set up a radar bubble and arranged sleeping quarters in the remains of a hospital that was bombed out during World War II. While in Corregidor, Zach Stout, George Wilkins, Bobby Warren, and Lee Oswald spent off-duty hours exploring caves, tunnels, and old battle sites from World War II. Lee Oswald took numerous color photographs of Stout, Wilkins, Warren, and fellow Marines that are now located in the National Archives. I obtained copies of these photographs and mailed them to Zach at his home in El Dorado, Kansas. Zach returned the photos to me and had identified several of his former Marine buddies. When I told Zach, the Warren Commission concluded that Lee Oswald learned to speak Russian in the Far East, Zach said, quote, "Where do people get these ideas? That's ridiculous. I never saw or heard him study any foreign language in Japan or anywhere else. Most of the time, we were either aboard ship or on maneuvers in the Philippines, and I was with Oswald almost every day. He didn't have time to study any foreign language." End quote. I then asked Zach if Lee Oswald ever had a Russian book or a Russian newspaper. Zach replied, "If he had any of those things, all of us would have known about it." End quote. Lee Oswald's good friend, George Wilkins, remembered that Lee Oswald was on mess duty the entire time he was in the Philippines and became a proficient cook. Former Marine Richard Bullock, who served with Lee Oswald in Japan, told several JFK researchers, quote, "He was not the guy I saw in the picture on TV shot by Jack Ruby. Looks nothing like him. That's not the man I knew. The man I knew was 30 to 40 pounds heavier and 3 to 4 inches taller than the man accused of killing President Kennedy." I spoke with Mr. Bullock, who lived in New Jersey, several times on the telephone. I sent Mr. Bullock a color photo of Marines on maneuvers in the Philippines that I found in the National Archives. Mr. Bullock looked at the photo, he identified several of his fellow Marines, and he returned the photo to me. On March 7, 1958, Lee Oswald and his unit left Corregidor aboard the USS Wexford County for Subic Bay in the Philippines. 11 days later, on March 18th, Lee Oswald and his group arrived at the dock in Yokosuka, Japan, and were driven by bus to nearby Atsugi. On March 27, 1958, Lee Oswald visited the base dentist. It should be remembered that Lee Oswald's friend, Ed Vogel, told the Warren Commission that Oswald lost a tooth after fighting with Johnny Neumeyer in October 1954. Lee Oswald was examined by the dentist and given dental impressions that were sent to a dental lab where a bridge was constructed. Dental prosthesis devices replace or repair missing or damaged teeth. While waiting for the bridge to be made, Lee Oswald would likely have been fitted with a temporary denture that would replicate his missing front tooth. Either a denture or a bridge could have been damaged or loosened that prompted his visit to the dentist. It appears that Lee Oswald had either a dental bridge or a denture fitted in order to replicate a damaged or missing tooth. On Lee Oswald's dental chart, there's a note, "Prosthesis failed." A dental prosthesis is an item made in a dental laboratory that is used to reconstruct defects such as missing teeth, missing parts of teeth, missing soft or hard structures of the jaw and palate. This note indicates that a previously installed prosthesis, either a laboratory-made dental bridge with porcelain or a denture, was no longer properly attached. A dental bridge, a prosthesis, is in this case would have been used to replicate Lee Oswald's front tooth that was damaged or broken or knocked out during Lee Oswald's fight with Johnny Neumeyer in October 1954, as described by Ed Vogel. Damage to Lee Oswald's front teeth can be seen in two photos. The photo on the left was taken by Ed Vogel in Helen Dufour's English class at Beauregard Junior High. Vogel sold this photo to Life magazine, and this photo appears in Life magazine. It appears to show that Lee Oswald is missing one or more front teeth. Now, Vogel told the Warren Commission that Lee Oswald lost a tooth as a result of a fight with Johnny Neumeyer in October 1954. The above photo was taken of Lee Oswald 4 years later in Atsugi, Japan in 1958 and shows discoloration and an unnatural and irregular appearance of his upper left front tooth. In 1995, I spoke for several hours on the telephone with Johnny Neumeyer, who was then living in Las Vegas. We talked about Lee Oswald and Beauregard Junior High. Mr. Neumeyer is a successful entrepreneur in the design and development of upscale restaurants. I asked Neumeyer if he remembered knocking out Lee Oswald's front tooth during the fight, but Mr. Neumeyer said he could not say for sure if Oswald lost a tooth. The next day, I tried to locate Ed Vogel to ask if he was certain that Lee Oswald lost a tooth in his fight with Neumeyer. I telephoned Quality Florists in New Orleans, a longtime family business owned by Ed Vogel's parents. Vogel's sister answered the phone, and we spoke for over an hour. She explained that one evening in 1971, her brother Ed called home, said he was in the hospital, and would return home the following morning. The next morning, Ed Vogel was dead, but from unknown causes. Vogel's sister told me that her father was convinced that his son's death had something to do with his friendship with Oswald. She then told me something that she did not understand. Vogel's sister said that news of her brother's death appeared in the local newspaper, but the newspaper reported that he died in Memorial Hospital. She said, "That's not true. That's not correct. My brother died not in the Memorial Hospital. He died at the Ochsner Clinic at age 31. Now, Dr. Alton Ochsner was a fervent anti-communist and a CIA asset. Ed Vogel died because he knew and befriended Harvey Oswald in the 8th grade at Beauregard Junior High in the spring of 1954. And 5 months later, Ed Vogel met and befriended Lee Oswald in the 9th grade at Beauregard. In the mid-1990s, I met Marina Oswald Porter and visited with her in her home on several occasions. During one of my visits, I asked Marina if she had been given any of the autopsy photos from Harvey Oswald's exhumation. The next time I visited Marina at her home, she handed me an envelope full of autopsy photographs. I had a few of these photographs copied, enlarged, and I then returned all of the original photos to Marina. The photo above is one of the photos given to me by Marina, showing complete natural teeth for Harvey Oswald, who was killed by Jack Ruby. On April 11, 1958, Lee Oswald was court-martialed and found guilty of possessing an unauthorized weapon, the .22 Derringer, that he shot himself in the arm with. Lee Oswald was sentenced to 20 days at hard labor, forfeiture of $50 in pay, and reduced to the rank of private. His confinement was suspended for 6 months on the condition he stay out of trouble. Lee Oswald was then put on KP duty, kitchen police, KP, for 3 months. The specific dates of Lee Oswald's KP duty are unknown, but it was given as punishment following his court-martial. KP consisted of military personnel assisting with meal preparation, peeling vegetables, serving, and cleanup. Cleanup included washing dishes and cleaning the kitchen and the dining areas. In May 1958, Daniel Patrick Powers came from Subi Point to Atsugi, where he rejoined his squad and once again saw Lee Oswald. Unknown to Powers, Lee Oswald had recently requested an extension of duty until May 1959, which was later approved. Powers last saw Lee Oswald in Japan before Powers returned to the United States in May of 1958. On June 20th, 1958, Lee Oswald visited the Bluebird Cafe in Yamato and saw Technical Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez, who had assigned Lee Oswald to KP duty. After having a couple of drinks, Lee Oswald approached a table occupied by Rodriguez, Staff Sergeant James Millen, and Millen's girlfriend. A drink spilled on Rodriguez's leg, which caused Rodriguez to jump up and confront Lee Oswald. Rodriguez kept his composure and told Lee Oswald he did not want to jeopardize his 6 years as a sergeant by fighting with a private. Lee Oswald then told Rodriguez that he was yellow if he didn't come outside and fight. Sergeant Milam called the military police. When the military police arrived, they took the small group to the police station. The next day, Sergeant Rodriguez signed a complaint against Lee Oswald. 1 week later, June 27, Lee Oswald faced court-martial. Acting as his own counsel, Lee Oswald claimed that he was drunk and accidentally spilled a drink on Rodriguez. Rodriguez told the court that Lee Oswald was not drunk, and he'd poured the drink on him deliberately. The judge ruled that Lee Oswald was guilty of using, quote, provoking words, end quote, to a non-commissioned officer and sentenced Lee Oswald to 28 days in the brig and forfeiture of $55. In addition, Lee Oswald's previous sentence of 20 days of hard labor was revoked. Lee Oswald went to the brig until August 13th, 1958, a period of more than 45 days. In June 1958, 17-year-old Harvey Oswald ended his employment at Pfisterer and moved to 3006 Bristol Road in Fort Worth with his caretaker mother. On July 29, 1958, the Marguerite Oswald Impostor opened a bank account at the First National Bank of Fort Worth and gave her address as 3006 Bristol Road. 18-year-old Harvey Oswald, who was then living with his caretaker mother, wrote a letter to the Pfisterer Dental Laboratory in New Orleans and said he had a job in Fort Worth selling shoes. Harvey Oswald's letter was read aloud to McBride and to the delivery boys by office manager Earl Williamson. Now, August 28th, 1958, we're going in chronological order. August 28th, 1958, Marguerite Clavery Oswald was working at Cox's department store in Fort Worth. The Marguerite Oswald impostor secured a job working for King Candy Company at the Fair Ridgely department store. Marguerite Clavery Oswald at Cox department store, the Marguerite Oswald impostor, Fair Ridgely store. Researchers will recall that while working at this store, a jar supposedly fell on the head of the Marguerite Oswald impostor, causing injury, and was cited as the reason for requesting an early discharge for Harvey Oswald from the Marines. Harvey Oswald's whereabouts and his employment at a shoe store in Fort Worth from mid-July through mid-September are unknown. After his employment ended at the shoe store, Harvey Oswald traveled from Fort Worth, Texas, and he arrived in Yokosuka, Japan, prior to September 14th, 1958. On August 13th, 1958, Lee Oswald was released from the brig. From August 14th to November 2nd, Lee Oswald was assigned to his unit in Atsugi. Now, in 1958, there was a very large, in fact the largest in the East, naval base at Yokosuka, Japan, that included a hospital, Marine barracks, and was a crucial hub for the entire U.S. 7th Fleet. The base was called the U.S. Fleet Activities Yosuka and was the largest U.S. naval complex in the Far East. This base was 30 miles south of Atsugi. September 1958, Lieutenant William K. Trail was assigned to the 1st Marine Air Wing in Atsugi. Lieutenant Trail recalled that when his group was preparing to depart Yokosuka, Japan, and sail to Taiwan, Oswald and another Marine were being held prisoners. That would be Lee Oswald. When Max 1 left for Taiwan, Paul Murphy, another Marine who knew Oswald, was still in the brig serving a 90-day sentence for wrongful appropriation of a camera. Lieutenant Trail said that 2 additional prisoners were picked up by a chaser with a gun, and the chaser accompanied these 2 prisoners during transport to Yokosuka, Japan, to Pingtung, North Taiwan. Now, it's possible that one of the 2 prisoners was Harvey Oswald. We don't know. But while waiting for departure for Japan, maybe he had briefly been held in the Marine brig to keep him separate and apart from Marines who bunked and worked with Lee Oswald in Atsugi. Murphy later worked with Harvey Oswald in Santa Ana, but told the FBI he did not know Oswald personally. On September 14th, according to Marine Corps Unit 15158, Harvey Oswald boarded the USS Catamount en route to Taiwan. Harvey Oswald was accompanied by a group of Marines who were not from Atsugi. Again, none of the Marines on this ship were from Atsugi. None of the Marines who knew the tall, husky Lee Oswald in Atsugi, including Zach Stout, Bobby Warren, George Wilkham, went to Taiwan. The shorter, thin Harvey Oswald was with a different group of Marines who would have no reason to question his identity. Some of the Marines who became acquainted with Harvey Oswald in Taiwan were later stationed with him at Max 9 in Santa Ana, California. While Harvey Oswald was in Taiwan, Lee Oswald remained in Atsugi, and he had repeated visits to the Naval Hospital. That's important, very important. Harvey Oswald left Yokosuka, Japan on September 14 and arrived in Pingtung, North Taiwan on September 30th. Lieutenant William Trail, who accompanied Harvey Oswald to Taiwan, saw little of Oswald in Taiwan, but spoke and saw him a few months later at the Marine Corps base in Santa Ana, California. After arriving in Taiwan, the Marines set up a temporary radar station. Lieutenant John Donovan remembered that Harvey Oswald took photographs of troop deployments, fighter aircraft, ammunition bunkers, and F-86 aircraft while in Taiwan. Now, following the assassination of President Kennedy, numerous photographs of aircraft, troops, and bunkers in Taiwan were found by the Dallas police among Harvey Oswald's possession and are now in the National Archives. I copied these photos. They appear above on the screen. I copied several of these photos, which I showed to Zach Stout, even though Zach never went to Taiwan. I was wondering if any of these people in Taiwan were from Itsugi. Anyway, Zach returned the photos to me and made a few handwritten notes. Said that he was almost positive these photos were taken in Taiwan. Lieutenant Donovan said that Harvey Oswald was very interested in the U-2 spy plane. After leaving Taiwan, Lieutenant Donovan was transferred to the Marine Corps Air Facility in Santa Ana and was Harvey Oswald's immediate supervisor. Donovan worked closely with Harvey Oswald until Oswald's discharge from the Marines in September. Now, Harvey Oswald, now in the Far East, was beginning the process of assuming the identity of Lee Oswald. It was important for Harvey Oswald to establish and show his presence in the Far East prior to his arrival in Santa Ana. Marines aboard the USS Catamount and Marines who were with Harvey Oswald in Taiwan would be able to confirm they were with Harvey Oswald in the South China Sea and in Taiwan. On the evening of October 4th, 1958, Harvey Oswald was assigned guard duty at Pingtung, Taiwan. About midnight, Lieutenant Charles Rhodes heard 4 or 5 rifle shots coming from the direction of the position Harvey Oswald was guarding. Rhodes drew his .45 automatic and ran toward the clump of trees to see what had happened. Rhodes found Harvey Oswald slumped against a tree, visibly shaking and crying, while holding his M1 rifle in his lap. Harvey Oswald told Rhodes that he saw men in the woods, challenged them, and then started shooting. Rhodes put his arm around Harvey Oswald's shoulder and slowly walked him back to his tent. Rhodes remembered, quote, he kept saying he just couldn't bear being on duty, end quote. Rhodes reported the incident to his commanding officer. While Harvey Oswald was aboard ship from September 14 through September 30th and in Taiwan until October 6, Lee Oswald visited the base hospital in Itsugi on several occasions. Marine Corps medical records for Naval Hospital 3835 show entries at the hospital for Lee Oswald on September 16, 20, 22, 29, 23, and October 6. This is a well-documented placement of Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald in different places at the same time. The Marine Corps unit diaries and the Marine Corps medical records prove that Harvey was in Taiwan, while at the same time Lee Oswald was in Itsugi. On October 6, 1958, Harvey Oswald was sent to Japan for, quote, medical treatment. A naval message about November 4th, 1959 reported, quote, Oswald served with Marine Air Control Squadrons in Japan and Taiwan with duties involving ground control intercept, end quote. A similar message was prepared by Lieutenant D.E. Sigsworth and sent from the Chief of Naval Intelligence to ALSUNA Alsuna in Moscow. This message stated, quote, Oswald served with Marine Air Control Squadron operations in Japan and Taiwan, end quote. In 1964, the One Commission received a memorandum from the Assistant General Counsel for the Department of Defense, which stated, Oswald departed Itsugi on September 4th, 1958, was at Pingtung, North Taiwan on September 30th, and returned to Itsugi on October 6th. Harvey Oswald was only in Taiwan for 1 week, but for the next 3 weeks, there's no written record, of Harvey Oswald's location, his method of travel, or his date of arrival. Now, a year later, in October 1959, when Harvey defected to the Soviet Union, he discussed his experience in Taiwan with CIA asset Priscilla Johnson at the Metropole Hotel in Moscow. After interview, Johnson wrote a news article which appeared in the New York Times, and she reported, quote, at 17, he appeared in the Marine Corps and was discharged in September, having spent 14 months in Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, and Formosa, Taiwan. Harvey Oswald was also interviewed by United Press International reporter Eileen Mosby, who was also a CIA asset. Harvey Oswald told Mosby that he had been in Formosa, Taiwan, and described his thoughts about American technicians instructing the Chinese military on the use of large guns. Now, on October 6, 1958, following his return from Taiwan to Japan, Harvey Oswald was sent to a Marine Corps air facility in Iwakuni, 400 miles southwest of Tokyo. The following day, October 7th, Lee Oswald was admitted to the Naval Hospital in Isugi. Again, Oswald in Iwakuni, Harvey, Lee Oswald in Tokyo, at Isugi. On October 10th, Lee Oswald had a colon examination for rectal bleeding. Lee Oswald was admitted to the hospital and was discharged on October 13th. Now, on October 16th and October 27th, Lee Oswald returned to the hospital for vaccinations that were required before returning to the United States. Harvey Oswald departed Iwakuni and returned to the United States during the last half of October 1958. But the location of his departure from Japan, the name of the vessel or aircraft, and the date of his departure are unknown. After arriving in the United States, Harvey Oswald was assigned to the Marine Corps Air Facility MAX 9 in Santa Ana, California, a lighter-than-air facility that was home to 600 Marines. Sergeant Irwin Lewis told the FBI that Harvey Oswald transferred to MAX 9 in either October or November 1958. Marine Corps medical records show that Harvey Oswald visited the hospital in Santa Ana, California on October 29, 1958, while Lee Oswald is still in Japan, because Lee Oswald does not leave Japan until November 2nd, 1958. At MAX 9 in Santa Ana, the Marines were assigned to bunk in small Quonset huts. Harvey Oswald was first assigned to a hut with Mac Osborne, Neil Tessum, Henry Roussel, Robert Allen, and Paul Hickey, but the date of his arrival and the number of his hut are unknown. Neither Robert Allen nor Paul Hickey were interviewed by the FBI. Mac Osborne told the FBI that he shared a bunk with Harvey Oswald in a 6-man Quonset hut, but was not asked for the name of the hut. Neil Tessum told the FBI that he occupied a 6-man Quonset hut for several weeks with Osborne, Bob Allen, and 3 other Marines. Again, the FBI did not ask for the number of the Quonset hut. Henry Roussel shared quarters with Harvey Oswald prior to Roussel's leave on December 16, 1958. Now, the FBI questioned these 3 Marines, but they failed to ask any of these men the date of Oswald's arrival at MAX 9 or the number of the hut they shared with him. We know why not. because when Harvey Oswald first arrived at MAX 9 in Santa Ana, California, in late October 1958, Lee Oswald was still in Japan. The Warren Commission also failed to ask any of these Marines who bunked or worked with Harvey Oswald from late October through December 1958, when Oswald arrived at MAX 9. Very simple to understand. October, November, December. Oswald is living in a bunk in a Quonset hut with Marines, 6 Marines, and Lee Oswald is still in Japan. And Lee Oswald does not arrive according to the Marine Corps Unit diaries, he's still in Japan, and he first arrives at MAX 9 in Santa Ana, California on December 22nd. So for the whole month, the month end of October, all of November, up until the 22nd of December, Harvey Oswald is sharing a Quonset hut with these 6 Marines. And we don't know the number of it, and we don't know from these Marines when Harvey Oswald arrived at MAX 9. Now, the Warren Commission had to know that Harvey Oswald arrived in Santa Ana in late October 1958 while Lee was in Japan. Now, when Lee Oswald arrived back in the United States, he did not arrive at Santa Ana. He arrived at El Toro, which is 7 miles south of the Santa Ana, California facility. And he arrived on December 22nd, 1958. Richard Dennis Call told the FBI he worked with Harvey Oswald at the Lighter-Than-Air Station in Santa Ana from December through September 1959. Staff Sergeant Camillus Brown told the FBI that he first met Oswald in 1958 when Oswald was first transferred to MAC 9 at Santa Ana. Brown said that Harvey Oswald appeared to be well versed on foreign matters and often spoke of the world's situation. Brown said that Harvey Oswald was with the squadron for about a year and said that Corporal Sizemore was Oswald's crew chief. Now, neither Sizemore, Sergeant Brown, or Richard Call were interviewed by the Warren Commission. Sergeant Irwin Lewis remembered that Harvey Oswald was transferred to MAX 9 in Santa Ana in, quote, October or November 1958. Henry Russell told the Warren Commission staff attorney John Hart Eli that he shared quarters with Harvey Oswald at MAX 9 prior to Russell's leave, which began on December 16th. When Russell returned from his leave on January 10th, Oswald had moved from Russell's hut to hut number 34 with Nelson Delgado. Now, again, these 6 Marines were with Harvey Oswald at Santa Ana in late October, all of November, and through December 22nd, 1958. Never called before the Warren Commission. Neither the FBI nor the Warren Commission requested the names of any Marines who bunked with Harvey Oswald when he first arrived at MAX 9 in late 1958. In fact, the Warren Commission never asked a single Marine at Santa Ana when Harvey Oswald first arrived at MAX 9 or the number of his hut. They intentionally avoided the date of Oswald's arrival at Santa Ana because Marine Corps records showed that Lee Oswald first reported to El Toro, California, the jet base at El Toro, on December 22nd. 3rd Marine Aircraft Wing, not MAX 9. Harvey was at MAX 9. The Warren Commission focused their attention on Marines like Nelson Delgado, who remembered Oswald's interest in Cuba, Castro, communism, and the Russian language. Nelson Delgado worked in a radar bubble with 5 enlisted men and 3 officers. Delgado told the Warren Commission about meeting and working with Harvey Oswald in Santa Ana in 1958. Delgado said, "We started talking, and we got to know each other quite well. At the time, he was commenting on the fight that Castro was having in the Sierra Madres." Castro, however, actually ended the fighting in the Sierra Madre Mountains several months earlier, on August 21st, 1958. Delgado told the Warren Commission, quote, "When I went on leave, it just so happened that my leave coincided with the 1st of January, when Castro took over," end quote. Delgado then told the Warren Commission, quote, "This is all before Christmas, 1958, before I took my leave," end quote. Delgado was telling the Warren Commission that his close friendship with Oswald developed in November and December of 1958 before Delgado took leave on New Year's Day. Nelson Delgado, Sergeant Irwin Lewis, Sergeant Cornelius Brown, Buddy Simcoe, Mac Osborne, Neil Tessum, Henry Russell, Robert Allen, Paul Hickey, all knew and associated with Harvey Oswald, Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald, from late October, in November, and through December 1958. Harvey Oswald had been working side by side with these Marines at Max 9 for almost 2 months. But all of these Marines were ignored by the Warren Commission, because when Harvey Oswald arrived at Santa Ana, late October, Lee Oswald was still in Japan. When Nelson Delgado returned from his leave in January 1959, Harvey Oswald was now bunking in hut number 34 with Delgado. Delgado and Harvey Oswald were together in hut 34 and worked together nearly every day until Harvey was discharged in September 1959. Delgado told the Warren Commission about Oswald's lack of interest in sports and said, quote, "He never went out for baseball, basketball, or handball. Oswald went out for the touch football team, but he quit before competition," end quote. Delgado told the Warren Commission that he and Harvey Oswald talked continuously about Castro, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. Harvey Oswald showed Delgado a copy of Das Kapital, the same book that Harvey Oswald had shown to Palmer McBride in New Orleans, the same book to William Henry Timmer in Stanley, North Dakota. By the end of 1958, Harvey Oswald was getting to know and work with fellow Marines at Max 9 in Santa Ana. A few of these Marines had been with Harvey Oswald in Taiwan and Iwakuni in October 1958, just a month before. Lieutenant John Donovan was with Harvey Oswald in Taiwan and was Oswald's immediate supervisor at the radar facility in Santa Ana. Lieutenant William Trail recalled that when his group was preparing to depart Yokosuka en route to Taiwan, he remembered Oswald. In early 1959, Lieutenant Trail saw and spoke with Oswald at the Marine Corps base in Santa Ana. Another Marine, Owen Dujanovic, said that he attended radar school with Harvey Oswald in 1957 and was with Harvey Oswald in Iwakuni, Japan in October 1958. A few months later, Dujanovic worked with Harvey Oswald at Max 9 in Santa Ana. Harvey Oswald's brief appearance in the Far East at Yokosuka, at Taiwan, and at Iwakuni was remembered by these Marines who later worked with Harvey Oswald at Max 9 in Santa Ana. Nobody who worked with Lee Oswald at Atsugi came to Santa Ana or met with Oswald in Santa Ana, Harvey Oswald in Santa Ana. Harvey Oswald, now in Max 9, had managed to establish his presence in the Far East with several Marines who worked with him at the Santa Ana Lighter Than Air Station facility. Now, Harvey Oswald speaking Russian. Buddy Allen Simcoe was stationed in the S-3 Operations Unit of MAX 9 in 1958. Simcoe worked at the squadron office in the General Administration and had noticed Russian literature that was addressed to Oswald. Simcoe said that even though he was not a personal friend of Oswald's, it was common knowledge that Harvey Oswald was studying Russian. Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald was promoting himself as a supporter of all things Russian. Sergeant Lewis said it was a matter of common knowledge that Oswald could read, write, and speak Russian, end quote. Sergeant Lewis was not interviewed by the Warren Commission. But where did Harvey Oswald learn to speak, read, and write Russian? Not in Texas, where he dropped out of the 10th grade after 1 month. Not in boot camp. Not at Camp Pendleton. Not at radar school. Not in Japan. But when he shows up at MAX 9, wow, he's able to read, speak, and write Russian. People need to remember that not one Marine in Japan heard Lee Oswald speak or even try to speak Russian, listen to Russian records, or receive Russian newspapers. Lee Oswald never spoke a word of Russian. But when Harvey Oswald arrived at MAX 9 in Santa Ana, he began to talk in his native Russian language, which he had learned as a child. Ask any supporter of the Warren Commission to explain and identify with documentation when and where Oswald learned to speak, read, and write Russian before he defected to Russia. You will hear nothing but explanation. No proof whatsoever, and you will never get an honest answer. On October 29, 1958, while Harvey Oswald was in Santa Ana, Lee was still in Japan. 4 days later, on November 2nd, 1958, Lee Oswald boarded the USS Barrett in Yokosuka. 13 days later, on November 15th, 1958, the USS Barrett arrived in San Francisco. On November 19, Lee Oswald began a 30-day leave and traveled to Fort Worth. On December 8, 1958, Lee Oswald opened a bank account at the Westside State Bank in Fort Worth with $200 and listed his address as Marine Corps Air Station in El Toro, California. Lee Oswald opened the bank account. After Lee Oswald's 30-day leave ended on December 19th, he reported for duty on December 22nd at the 3rd Marine Air Wing in El Toro, California, a jet base that had 5,000 or 6,000 Marines. This Marine Corps jet base is 7 miles southeast of the much smaller Leiden Air Facility in Santa Ana. Now, Harold Flower served as chief of the Criminal Investigation Division at El Toro. Flower said that neither the FBI nor the Office of Naval Intelligence conducted an investigation at El Toro or requested records from El Toro after the assassination of President Kennedy. Flower said that Oswald was stationed at the Marine Corps Air Facility at Santa Ana, which is a helicopter facility and is separate from El Toro. In El Toro, Jerry Ellis Pitts told the FBI that Lee Oswald worked as an electronics technician in the radar unit. Pitts recalled that Oswald passed out drunk in a parking lot next to the barracks and said this also occurred in Japan. Pitts also said that Lee Oswald bitterly resented anyone calling him by the name of Harvey or Harv and would fight anyone who persisted in calling him by these names. Lieutenant Michael DePadro told the FBI that Lee Oswald worked in the Combat Air Control Squadron at El Toro. DePadro said that he had no recollection of Lee Oswald receiving Russian literature. DePadro also said that Lee Oswald was left-handed. I'm going to repeat that. Lee Oswald was left-handed and talented in drawing. From 1956 through the fall-winter of 1958, Lee Oswald's tall, nice-looking mother lived in apartment number 3 at 3830 West 6th in Fort Worth. In late October, John Pick, his wife, and 2 children left Mitchell Air Force Base in New York and drove across the country en route to San Francisco. The Picks arrived in Fort Worth on October 30th and spent the evening with his mother, Marguerite Clavery Oswald. Pick drove his car up behind the house and locked the gates to prevent his hubcaps being stolen. Pick did not remember the address of his mother's house, but told the Warren Commission, quote, "It was a little circle. What she lived on described the street. It was a circle, something like that," end quote. Now, John Pick told the Warren Commission that when he and his family visited his tall, nice-looking mother, she was working at Cox's department store in Fort Worth. Pick said he visited his mother when she was working at Cox's, and that was 1958. After leaving Fort Worth, John Pick and his family drove to San Francisco and then flew to Tachikawa Air Force Base in Japan on November 10th, 1958. Pick's younger brother, Lee Oswald, had departed Japan a week earlier on November 2nd aboard the USS Barrett en route to San Francisco. In August 1958, the short, dumpy, heavyset Marguerite Oswald Impostor began working at King Candy Counter in the Fair Ridge department store in Fort Worth. In October, when Pick was driving through Fort Worth, spending the night with his mother, Marguerite Oswald Impostor was working at King Candy. Now, in the fall-winter of 1958, the tall, nice-looking Marguerite Oswald left Fort Worth and returned to New Orleans, where she continued her usual occupation of working in upscale clothing and department stores. Mrs. Logan Magruder, who had known Marguerite Oswald for nearly 20 years, visited her at Krieger's department store in New Orleans. Mrs. Oris Duane, who had known Marguerite Clavery Oswald since 1943, saw and spoke with her at Goldring's department store in New Orleans. Top-level FBI officials knew that Marguerite Clavery Oswald was not the short, heavy-set caretaker of Harvey Oswald. This is why the FBI never interviewed co-workers or employers of Marguerite Clavery Oswald when she worked in Fort Worth, at Clyde Campbell Men's Store in 1956 and 1957, the City of Fort Worth in 1957, Paul's Shoe Store in 1957 and 58, Family Publications in 1958, or Cox's department store. FBI never interviewed any of Marguerite Clavery Oswald's co-workers or employers at Goldring's or Krieger's or Holmes' department store from 1958 through 1961. The FBI never obtained any employment information, W-4 forms, W-2 forms, payroll records, employment applications, or they never interviewed co-workers from any of these companies in Fort Worth or New Orleans that employed the tall, nice-looking Marguerite Clavery Oswald from 1956 through 1961. The FBI's failure to interview people who employed or knew the tall, nice-looking Marguerite Clavery Oswald was intentional. And this is confirmation that high-level FBI officials knew about the two Marguerite Oswalds. They're ignoring Marguerite Clavery Oswald, and they're focusing on the Marguerite Oswald imposter. After Marguerite Clavery Oswald left Fort Worth in 1958 and returned to New Orleans, the heavy-set Marguerite Oswald imposter became known to the public and the press as the Marguerite Oswald, mother of Lee Harvey Oswald, who was shot by Jack Ruby. From 1956 through 1964, the FBI ignored the tall, nice-looking Marguerite Clavery Oswald and focused their attention on the short, heavyset Margaret Oswald Impostor, the caretaker mother of Harvey Oswald. After Lee Oswald completed his 30-day leave, he reported for duty at El Toro, California. The Warren Commission began referring to El Toro and Santa Ana as one facility, El Toro, Santa Ana. FBI reports of Lee Oswald at El Toro and Harvey Oswald at Santa Ana were reported by the Warren Commission as one location, El Toro, Santa Ana, and one Lee Harvey Oswald. While Harvey Oswald was at Santa Ana, making preparations for his upcoming defection to the Soviet Union, Lee Oswald was sent from El Toro to the Lake Mead Marine Base north of Las Vegas, Nevada. Gerald Hansen was stationed at the Lake Mead Marine Base in December 1958 and told the FBI about a Marine who he believed was Lee Harvey Oswald. Prior to taking leave on December 26, 1958, Hansen witnessed an unusual incident during work. One of the supply clerks called out the name Harvey to a Marine who had the name Benjamin stenciled on his shirt. Curious as to why the clerk called the man Harvey instead of Benjamin, Hansen asked the supply clerk why he called the man by a different name. The supply clerk refused to answer and told Hansen to direct his question to Sergeant Ronald Ackerman. Ackerman told Hansen that even though the name stenciled on the Marine's uniform was Benjamin, he was just using the name Harvey. Ackerman further explained that even though the man was using the name Harvey, his real name was Oswald, and he was from Texas. Hansen subsequently verified that this Marine was using the surname Harvey when he heard the company commander, Captain Vernon S. Munsell, address the man as Corporal Harvey. In addition, Hansen later saw the man wearing a utility shirt with the surname Harvey stamped on it. Needless to say, Gerald Hansen was not interviewed by the Warren Commission. But we now understand Lee Oswald was briefly assigned to one of the most closely guarded bases in the United States after he returned to El Toro on November 22nd, 1958. The Lake Mead base was a storage and transfer area for nuclear weapons, which were tested at the Nevada test site. It is now known as Nellis Air Force Base and is one of 3 Air Force nuclear storage facilities in the United States. This base is on the northern outskirts of Las Vegas and is visible from cars traveling on Interstate 15 and from aircraft approaching the large Las Vegas airport. Now, Warren Commission staff attorney John Hart Ely was chosen to gather background information on Lee Harvey Oswald, his mother, and his family. Ely was gathering information and reading reports about Oswald in the Marines at Max 9 at Santa Ana. On the morning of May 7th, 1964, Ely received a phone call from a former Marine who knew Oswald. The man identified himself as Alan Graff and said that he was Oswald's platoon sergeant at the Marine Corps station in El Toro, California. Now, Ely was confused because he had already talked with Marines who worked with Oswald at Max 9 in Santa Ana. Ely had never heard that Oswald was stationed at El Toro. Graff told Ely that he arrived at El Toro in March 1959 and soon became a close friend of Lee Oswald. Ely said that he and Oswald were at Marine Headquarters Group 3 Airport Radar Team 1 at El Toro and not at Max 9 in Santa Ana. Graff insisted that this was after Lee Oswald returned from the Far East and they were stationed together in El Toro and not in Santa Ana. Graff said that Lee Oswald never studied a foreign language, didn't speak Russian, and recalled no nicknames for Oswald. Graff said that he and Oswald spent a lot of time together, often went to the movies. Ely could not understand how Sergeant Graff could be with Oswald at El Toro, while at the same time Oswald was with Delgado and other Marines at Santa Ana. Now, Graff gave the names of several Marines who knew and worked with Lee Oswald at El Toro, including John Castle, Raymond Glidden, James King, Abraham Rubenstein, Gautier, Hurd, Malden, Sawchuk. Eli knew the names given by Mr. Graff were not the names of Marines at the Lighterthan Air Station in Santa Ana. Eli wrote in his typewritten notes, quote, "Not in unit," because Eli knew these were not the names of Marines who worked with Oswald at Santa Ana. Mr. Eli then wrote, quote, "What's happening here? A switch would fit McBride," end quote. We now understand that Staff Attorney John Hart Eli knew about McBride working with the second Oswald at Pfisterer in New Orleans in 1957, while at the same time Oswald was in Japan. Graff then told Mr. Eli that Lee Oswald greatly enjoyed firing a rifle and had scored 229 points on the rifle range, a high marksman, only 3 points behind Graff's score. Eli could not understand why Oswald had a marksman score of 229 when Eli already knew about Oswald's much lower score of 211. Eli's handwritten notes are numerous and are a clear indication that Eli had strong suspicions about a second Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans while he was working at the Warren Commission. After interviewing Alan Graff, Mr. Eli wrote a memo to Albert Jenner, his Warren Commission supervisor, that read, quote, "He is equally clear that they were stationed together at El Toro and not at Santa Ana. They were," he says, "stationed with Marine Wing Headquarters Group 3, Airport Radar Team 1, and were not at the Lighterthan Air Station in Santa Ana. Moreover, the names he, Graff, mentioned as having been in his unit are not those mentioned as having been in the unit after Oswald returned from Japan," end quote. The stories and memories of Marines who knew and worked with Lee Oswald at El Toro remain unknown. Nobody was interviewed from El Toro, as do Lee Oswald's Marine Corps records from El Toro. Not any of the Marines from El Toro, not a one, were interviewed by the FBI or the Warren Commission or the House Select Committee. The FBI and Warren Commission limited their investigation to Russian-speaking Harvey Oswalds and Marines with whom he worked at the Lighterthan Air Facility in Santa Ana. This resulted in very few, if any, FBI reports about Lee Oswald in El Toro. I hope that everyone now understands that the Marine Corps Air Station in El Toro and the Marine Corps Air Facility in Santa Ana are two very different bases and are 7 miles apart. Lee Oswald was assigned to Max 3 at the large Marine Corps Air Facility in El Toro, while Harvey Oswald was assigned to Max 9 at the much smaller Lighterthan Air Facility at Santa Ana. Once again, Lee Oswald at Max 3, El Toro. Harvey Oswald at Max 9, Santa Ana. Warren Commission Attorney John Hart Eli realized in 1964 that one Lee Harvey Oswald was stationed at Santa Ana, while a duplicate Lee Oswald was stationed at El Toro at the same time. Two Lee Harvey Oswald. Years later, in 1975, Mr. Eli wrote, quote, "But devising a coherent and credible theory to explain what happened in Dallas on November 22, 1963, one that isn't forced to hypothesize a number of duplicate Lee Harvey Oswalds, has proved quite a different matter," end quote. Mr. Eli was telling us, in his own words, there were duplicate Lee Harvey Oswalds. We can only guess how many other Warren Commission members and staff shared Mr. Eli's thoughts. Now, we don't know how many agents of the FBI or members of the Warren Commission knew about two Oswalds in 1964. But 11 years later, in 1975, the New York Times published a full essay written by Mr. Eli about the Warren Commission and the assassination of President Kennedy. So, Mr. Eli memoranda is lengthy and should be read by everyone. On December 5, 1958, the short, heavy-set Marguerite Oswald impostor was working alone in the candy booth at the Fair Ridge department store in Fort Worth. She claimed that a jar of candy fell on her face and nose. There were no witnesses to the accident. This Marguerite Oswald impostor claimed to have suffered a work-related injury and sought medical attention. The following day, Dr. Milton Goldberg noted a small laceration on her nose with swelling. 2 days later, she returned for another examination. On December 29, 1959, she returned and complained of headaches and pains in her neck. Dr. Goldberg determined she had suffered no partial or no permanent disability. Now, during her last visit to Dr. Goldberg's office in January 1959, this Marguerite Oswald impostor told Dr. Goldberg, quote, that her son wanted to defect to Russia. And this is in an FBI report dated 11/22/63. This woman's first-hand knowledge that Harvey Oswald would defect to Russia 10 months later is confirmation of her involvement and her knowledge of Harvey Oswald and Lee Oswald. By the end of 1958, the last phase of the Oswald project, merging Harvey Oswald with Lee Oswald, was now complete. In October 1959, Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald will defect to Russia. The CIA will soon have succeeded in placing a young Russian-speaking man in Russia with verifiable records of his birth in New Orleans, his family connections, his Marine Corps service, and his U.S. passport. From January through September 1959, all entries in the Marine Corps unit diaries and the Marine Corps unit rosters will follow Harvey Oswald. After leaving the Marine Corps in September 1959, Harvey Oswald would defect to Russia. 1 month later, in October, while Harvey Oswald is in Russia for the next 2.5 years, Lee Oswald will be seen at various locations in the United States, including New Orleans, Florida, Dallas, Fort Worth, New York City. In January 1959, with Marguerite Clavery Oswald living in New Orleans, the news media and the public will soon be introduced to the short, heavy-set Marguerite Oswald as the mother of Lee Harvey Oswald. My friend and author Jim Mars told me that when he met Marguerite Oswald, she gave him a business card that read, quote, Marguerite Oswald, mother of Lee Harvey Oswald, end quote, trying to promote herself as the mother of Lee Oswald. The merging of identities was now complete. Russian-speaking Harvey Oswald would soon defect and focus on the assignment given to him by the CIA. Lee Oswald would be seen together with anti-Castro Cuban exiles in Florida and New Orleans. The Marguerite Oswald impostor would soon be known to the public, the press, and soon to the Warren Commission as Lee Harvey Oswald's mother. The year 1958 places Harvey Oswald at the Pfisterer Dental Laboratory in New Orleans from January through mid-June 1958, while Lee Oswald was in Japan. From September 14th through October 1958, Harvey Oswald is in Taiwan, while Lee Oswald visits the Naval Hospital in Atsugi. We then see Harvey Oswald at Iwakuni, Japan, while Lee Oswald is still at Atsugi. Finally, In late October, November 1958, Harvey Oswald is at MAX 9 in Santa Ana, California, while Lee Oswald is in Japan and then sails back to the United States. After studying the background of two Lee Harvey Oswalds for many years, I realized that both Oswalds had a life before the Marines, during the Marines, and after the Marines through November 22nd, 1963. But who or what government agency was responsible for creating two Lee Harvey Oswalds? I believe the group of people who managed and controlled the movements and locations of Harvey Oswald, Lee Oswald, and the two Marguerite Oswalds from 1947 through 1963 are the same people responsible for the assassination of President Kennedy.